Hello, my name is Vidali Westgate, and we are going to talk about ciabatta with Biga today. Now, ciabatta is usually a wet dough. The hydration is very high, close to about 100% in water, while the pre-ferment, the Biga, is quite dry, and that is about it is about a firm consistency that the acetic acid will produce strength from the gluten used in the hydration. The reason why the biga is used is because the final dough itself is so wet because of the amount of water that is used. So the biga will ferment over 12 to 14 hours at room temperature, or if you're not going to use it within that time, you can always refrigerate it, and that'll slow down the fermentation rate. For the final dough, you're going to have the biga, the water, the bread flour, salt, and fresh yeast. This recipe calls for fresh yeast, but we don't use fresh yeast, we use dry yeast. So for the fresh yeast, you convert it to dry, and since the fresh yeast calls for 57 grams, you're going to multiply that 0.4, which gives you 22.8, and then you're going to minus 22.8 by 57, and it gives you 34.2. Now the 34.2 is the amount of water you will add to the final dough mixture, and the 22.8 is the yeast amount that you would use with the final dough. Now, scaling out all these ingredients are very important. If you misscale them, your dough could end up completely wrong and you have to restart the entire process, which can set you behind a lot while making breads. Now, when you mix the final dough, you're going to pour the water and everything into the mixer, and then you're going to chop up the biga into pieces and add them separately. Now, before you even get to the mixing, I overjumped on my part, you must find the water temperature. Now, the ideal temperature of the dough is between 75 and 78, and to find the water temperature, you must find the room temperature, the pre-ferment temperature, the friction factor, and the flour temperature. Now, the flour temperature in this case is 69, the friction factor is 28, the pre-ferment is 69, and the room temperature is 71. You add all these together and you get 237. Then you're going to I use 78 as my desired dough temperature, and then you're going to multiply that by the amount of factors that are involved in finding the water temperature, and you multiply 78 by 4, and that equals 312, and then you're going to minus 312 by 237, which gives you 75, and you're going to get the amount of water at a 75 degree. Now, since there is a high hydration in the ciabatta, you are going to have folds. So since the water hydration in this is extremely high, the dough is going to be wet and sticky. So once it is out of the mixer, you are going to put it into a proofing bin. And while it is in the proofing bin, it is going to be fermenting for about 2.5 to 3 hours. And you're going to fold the ciabatta every 30 minutes to allow more gluten development within the dough. If this was a dough that did not have much hydration, you would not fold it about 3 to 4 times within the period that it would ferment, because the gluten development is already there, and you have a gluten window with the doughs that do not have a high hydration. So when you take the ciabatta out of the mixture, you're going to take the temperature and the time that it came out and write it on the top of the lid of the pan. to ensure that you got the desired dough temperature that you were looking for. And that'll tell you if the dough needs to be near the oven to heat up to higher the temperature a little bit, or if it needs to go on top of a, a bin to let it cool down. While the bread is fermenting, you're going to fold it every half hour, and after the last fold, you're going to let it rest. And then before the cutting, you are going to heavily flour the table because, as I said, the ciabatta is a very wet dough and it's extremely sticky. So if you do not flour the table properly, the dough will stick to the table and the result will not be a good result. As here on this drawing, the table is heavily floured, and you're going to flip the bin onto the table, and the ciabatta should easily fall out. You want to be careful to make sure that it does not fold over itself. And after it is fully on the table, you're going to stretch it just a little bit, not much to degas it. And then you're going to take your bench scraper and you're going to, with it in size, you're going to then measure it out down the bread, and then after you do that, you're going to cut the bread. You want to make sure that you overlap it from here. You want to make sure that you cut it, and you want to overlap the bench scraper so you're not cutting on like a new piece. You want to make sure you cut from where you cut last, and just cut down the dough. Now, since this is such a wet dough, you are not going to scale it. You could scale it to 500 grams, but in this class we did not scale it. So you are going to, after the whole piece is cut, you are going to length it within 1.5 bench scrapers and then cut it, and you're going to continue doing that until you have all the pieces. And then you're going to put, after you cut each piece, you're going to put it onto a heavily floured couche, and you can fit about 2 couches. I mean, you're going to fit 2, you're not going to fit 2, you're going to fit 6 onto a couche while putting 2 on each row, while separating the breads from in between with the couche. So since this ciabatta does not have a pre-shape, you are just going to let it rest for about an hour to an hour and a half about. And then after that rest period, you are going to gently make sure that you have the loading docks ready and the oven set with the steam to 0.25 with the oven temperature to 450. Now when you place them on the loading dock, you're going to have a loading board, and you're going to have it at and the loading, you're going to have the breadboard on a bin next to the loading, and after everything is all set up, you are going to use your hands. Make sure that they were heavily floured because the ciabatta is very wet, so it will stick to your fingers and you do not need that. You're going to spread your hands and you're going to put your thumbs underneath the ciabatta and use the rest of your hands to flip it so the ciabatta lands on your 4 other fingers, and you're going to carefully place it onto the loading dock, and you can fit about 6 to 7, maybe 8 onto the loading dock. And after you get about all of them onto the dock, you're going to put them in together and maybe with the help of somebody else, and you are going to pull the loading dock away from the oven. Make sure that it's locked so that way all the bread falls off it and onto the oven. Then you're going to close the door, press start, and let it bake for about 15 to 20 minutes, checking on it, seeing how it's doing. While it is baking, you can see the steam helps the Maillard reaction, which gives it that crust. With the Maillard reaction, when it gives it the crust, you can see when the goldening happens, that is the sugars breaking down with the presence of proteins. You always want to make sure that you have steam on before you press start, because if there is no steam, you will not get the yeast. You will not get the crust and the golden color. It will just look pale and white, and it just wouldn't look like the dough that you need it to look like. Now, after the dough is done baking, you're going to carefully unload it, and using a breadboard, you're going to pick them up and place them on a rack to cool. Now, after all of the baking, so now that the bread is done and cooling, I'm going to talk about a little bit more about how the dough ferments. Now, dough can ferment with a pre-ferment, or it can be naturally leavened with itself, as you will learn in the sourdough procedure. But for the doughs you use pre-ferments with, you use yeast, and the water, yeast, and bread flour helps and creates the CO2, alcohol, acid, and energy. Now, the acid is broken down into two, which is acidic and lactic, and then the energy gives off heat. Now, with the lactic acid, it gives off a mild, complex, this is more created within the early fermentation areas, whereas the acidic acid is more into the longer pre-ferment stages and gives more of a sour flavor. And when the water is more increased, the pre-ferment will ferment a lot quicker and faster with a more wet and warmer environment. Now, if the dough is drier and colder, it will not ferment. As I was saying earlier, when you can put the pre-ferment inside the fridge to retard the process of fermentation, it will slow it down so it doesn't create as much as it would at room temperature, where it is moist and warm. Fermentation also helps with the volume and the crumb structure. If you had no fermentation or pre-ferment, then the dough will have basically no crumb and no volume, and also no flavor. The pre-ferments give it more of a flavor because of how long it sits out and develops all those CO2s, alcohol, and acid, with those acid flavors of acidic and lactic. Now, as you can see, the bread making process requires a lot of attention that most bakers know how to do. And if you want to make the perfect bread, then you have to follow the way on how to make bread. You always want to make sure that your pre-ferment is made correctly and is actually fermented over the period of time and how it is. And then you want to make sure that you use the steps of bread making, which are scaling. You want to make sure that those are very accurate scaling. And then you want to mix with the 3 types of mixing methods and how you would use them. which the first one is short mix, intensive mix, and improved mix. You want to make sure that you know which type of bread that you are going to use with that mixing method. And then you're going to use the bulk fermentation, because that is very important, because it gives the dough time to rest and to get all of that CO2, alcohol, and other things that give that dough the flavor and volume and other necessary things such as that. And then you want to make sure that you divide it correctly. And you want to, after you divide and pre-shape, if the dough needs it, you want to make sure that it rests, so that way the gluten can be withstanding for the final shaping. And then after you do all your final shaping, you want to make sure that you proof it, because if it is underproof, the loaves will be unshaped and they won't turn out the way you would like them to. And if the dough is overproof, then they will be flat and dense and not very good looking, and that's just something that you do not want. And you always want to make sure that you are baking correctly and you have the mise en place for the baking, and you use steam on the ovens to give it that golden color and for the Maillard reaction to apply. And you always want to make sure that you're using the correct loading and unloading of the ovens and allow them to cool and properly storage the breads as to where they need to be. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Again, my name is Vitali Westgate, and I hope you have a great day.